The night had a suffocating stillness, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the tide. Greyhaven's coastline, jagged and cruel, seemed to beckon the waves like a predator luring its prey. Beneath the pale glow of the crescent moon, the wreck of the whispering tide jutted out of the water like the ribs of a long-dead beast. It was a place every local knew to avoid, a warning whispered from parent to child. But tonight, the warnings were drowned out by something far more sinister. Jacob Lowry had fished these waters his entire life, his hands rough with salt and time. But tonight was different. He had anchored his small boat closer to the wreck than he ever dared before, lured by the promise of an unusually bountiful catch. That was the first mistake. His flashlight beam wavered as he hauled in the first net. The fish were restless, their slick bodies twisting violently against the mesh, as though trying to escape something unseen. Too close, Jacob muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with unease. But he didn't stop. Home, he wouldn't stop. The whispers wouldn't let him. At first, he thought it was the wind threading through the jagged remains of the wreck. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. It curled around his ears, soft and seductive, speaking a language he didn't recognize but understood all the same. His hands fumbled as he reached for the next net. The whispers grew louder, urging him to look toward the shipwreck. His flashlight flickered as he turned toward the wreck, the beam slicing through the darkness. He froze. In the shallows near the wreck, a figure stood, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. Water lapped around its ankles, though the tide hadn't reached that far yet. The figure raised an arm, beckoning. Jacob's breath hitched. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of a bucket, sending it clattering to the deck. The sound was deafening against the oppressive silence that followed. He scrambled to right himself, his heart pounding like a war drum. The figure didn't move. It stood there, unwavering, its gaze, if it had eyes, locked onto him. He turned away, gripping the wheel of his boat, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever was watching. But the whispers had taken root in his mind, a chorus of insistent commands that drowned out reason. He found himself turning back to the wreck, unable to resist. The figure was closer now, standing at the waterline. Though the tide hadn't advanced, its shape seemed to shimmer as though it wasn't entirely real. Or perhaps it was too real, its presence more solid than the world around it. Jacob's flashlight fell from his hand, the light extinguished as it hit the deck with a dull thud. The whispers surged, rising to a crescendo that made his head throb. He clutched his ears, falling to his knees, but there was no escape. His vision blurred as he stared at the wreck. The figure began to wade into the water, its movements unnaturally smooth, as though the ocean bent to its will. Leave. Jacob tried to scream, but the word came out as a rasp. The figure reached the side of his boat, its hands gripping the edge, with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Its face loomed closer, its features obscured by a veil of water that clung to it like a second skin. The last thing Jacob saw before the darkness claimed him was the figure's mouth, opening wide enough to swallow the moonlight, and the water around his boat roiling like it was alive. The next morning, the boat drifted aimlessly into the harbor, empty save for a single net. It was torn to shreds, and the fish inside were gone. The locals whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the wreck. Jacob's name was added to the growing list of the missing, though no one said it aloud. Far from the harbor, Evelyn Carter watched the scene unfold from the window of her childhood home. She hadn't intended to return to Greyhaven, but something had drawn her back. Something she couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. She stared at the wreck on the horizon, the faint outline of the whispering tide, visible even from here. In the pit of her stomach, she knew this was only the beginning. The morning air felt heavy, even inside my childhood home. The faint scent of salt water and decay lingered, seeping through the cracks in the windows. I couldn't escape it. I sat at the old wooden table in the kitchen, staring at the chipped mug in my hands. Coffee had always been my way of grounding myself, but today it tasted bitter. No matter how much sugar I stirred in, the whispers from the town crept in through the walls. They spoke of Jacob, of the boat that had returned without him. His name joined the growing list of others, people who had vanished near the wreck. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to take another sip. Coming back to Greyhaven was a mistake, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the town that had drawn me back. It was the wreck. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. The window above the sink framed the distant outline of the whispering tide. Even now, the wreck loomed, a dark silhouette against the water, daring anyone to come closer. My heart raced as I watched the waves lapping around its skeletal remains, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It felt like it was watching me back. Evelyn, don't even think about it. My aunt's voice startled me. My aunt's voice startled me. She stood in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, and her expression hard. She knew me too well. You're not going near that thing. Promise me. I nodded, but it wasn't a promise I intended to keep. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers in my head had grown louder. They weren't real, I told myself that again and again. But the longer I stayed, the more they wrapped around my thoughts, urging me toward the shore. I slipped out of the house under the cover of darkness, the cool night air wrapping around me like a shroud. The town was eerily silent. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old buildings seemed muted. My footsteps on the cobblestone echoed as I made my way to the harbor. The wreck waited for me, its jagged remains casting long shadows over the water. The whispers grew louder as I reached the shoreline, their cadence almost rhythmic. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the sound of the waves instead. But as I stepped onto the weathered dock, I felt something shift. The air was thick, oppressive, and the tide seemed to pull harder, as though it was alive. There was a small rowboat tied to the dock. It looked ancient, its paint peeling and its oars barely holding together. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rope. The sensible part of me screamed to turn back, but the whispers drowned it out. My fingers moved on their own, untying the boat. The water was cold as I pushed the boat into the waves and climbed inside. My breath fogged in the air as I gripped the oars, rowing toward the wreck. The distance seemed to stretch forever, the wreck never quite getting closer no matter how hard I rowed. The whispers swelled, surrounding me, filling my mind with fragments of words I couldn't understand, but felt in my bones. When the wreck finally loomed above me, I froze. Up close, it was even more grotesque, its twisted beams reaching toward the sky like the fingers of a drowning giant. The water around it churned unnaturally, as though something beneath the surface was alive. My pulse quickened as I realized the whispers were coming from the wreck itself, emanating from its very bones. A sudden splash broke the spell, and I whipped my head toward the sound. The water rippled violently, but there was nothing there. My breath hitched as the boat rocked beneath me. Something brushed against the hull, and I leaned over the edge, peering into the dark water. At first, I saw nothing but my own pale reflection staring back. But then the shadows shifted, and I saw them, faces. Dozens of them, distorted and contorted, their mouths open in silent screams. My stomach churned, and I pulled back, clutching the edges of the boat to steady myself. The water surged, and the boat tipped dangerously to one side. I gasped, scrambling to keep my balance. Ellie. A hand shot out of the water, its fingers impossibly long and clawed. It gripped the edge of the boat, and I screamed, my voice swallowed by the night. Another hand emerged, and another, until the boat was surrounded. They pulled. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the hands were relentless. The water rose around me, cold and suffocating, dragging me closer to the wreck. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling my ears until I couldn't think. Just as the water closed over my head, everything went silent. The world was different when I woke. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the ocean had claimed not just my body, but my very existence. My eyes fluttered open to a haze of pale light filtering through a canopy of twisted beam. The wreck. I was inside the wreck, Every breath I took carried the faint sting of salt and something darker, something metallic like blood. My fingers trembled as they reached for the wooden planks beneath me. Englewood dikes beneath me. They were slick with seawater and covered in strange markings, carvings that seemed too deliberate to be random. My head throbbed as I tried to piece together how I had ended up here. But the memory of those hands, their clawed grip, sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of dripping water echoing through the cavernous interior. I forced myself to sit up, my body protesting with every movement. My clothes clung to me, soaked and heavy, but that was the least of my concerns. Around me, the wreck seemed alive. The beams twisted and groaned, their shapes unnatural, as though they had grown rather than been built. The light flickered, casting shadows that moved just out of sync with the rest of the room. I took a step forward, my bare feet splashing into shallow pools of water that had gathered in the crevices of the wood. The carvings continued along the walls, their intricate patterns both beautiful and horrifying. They spiraled outward, forming shapes that felt almost organic. Faces seemed to emerge from the patterns, their hollow eyes staring at me with silent accusation. The whispers began again, faint at first, like the echo of waves against the shore. But they grew louder, filling the space until I couldn't tell if they were in the air or in my head. They spoke no language I could recognize, yet I understood them on some primal level. They weren't just sounds. They were thoughts, feelings, emotions, all crashing into me like the tide. I moved deeper into the wreck, drawn by a pull I couldn't resist. Every step felt wrong, as though the floor might give way beneath me. But it didn't. The beams held firm, their shapes shifting subtly as I passed. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, until I was engulfed in near darkness. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the wall for guidance, and recoiled as something wet and pulsing met my touch. The wall was alive, but I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The whispers surged, their tone frantic, urgent, demanding. I turned to run, but the corridor behind me had vanished. In its place was an endless expanse of shadow, broken only by the faint glimmer of water, reflecting what little light remained. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized there was no way out. "Let me go," I whispered, though my voice sounded foreign in the vast emptiness. The wreck didn't answer, but the whispers did. They softened, almost soothing, as though mocking my fear. The light ahead brightened, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward, its steps slick with seawater and algae. I didn't want to descend, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the wreck's heart. The staircase ended in a chamber, its walls covered in more of those carvings. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. On the pedestal rested an object, a small, ornate box, its edges gilded and its surface covered in the same intricate patterns as the walls. The whispers converged, their voices becoming one, clear and undeniable. Take it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box. Envelop, sayud, more box. The air around it shimmered, almost alive, as though the box itself were breathing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it, to turn and run, but the pull was too strong. My fingers brushed against the surface, and the whispers stopped. Silence. Shh. Complete and total silence. Then the box opened on its own, revealing a darkness that was deeper than the shadows around me. It was a void, a bottomless chasm that seemed to swallow the light. From within the box came a sound, a low, guttural hum that resonated in my chest. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, as the darkness reached out, tendrils of shadow curling around my hair. Pain shot through me, sharp and blinding, as the tendrils burrowed into my skin. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the void, and fell to my knees. The carvings on the walls began to glow, their patterns shifting and writhing, as though alive. The whispers returned, louder than ever, chanting in unison. The tendrils retreated, leaving behind marks on my skin that glowed faintly in the dim light. My hand trembled as I lifted it, staring at the patterns that had etched themselves into my flesh. They matched the carvings on the walls, the box, the wreck itself. And then I heard it, a voice, clear and cold, cutting through the whispers like a blade. You are chosen. I didn't know what it meant, but the wreck seemed to shudder in response. We rule, but the shadows around me moved, coalescing into shapes that watched me with hollow eyes. The darkness in the box swirled, growing, spreading until it consumed the room, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The wreck was gone. I was standing on the shoreline, the waves lapping at my feet. The box was gone, but the marks remained, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The whispers were silent, but I knew they weren't gone. They were inside me now. They were inside me now. The days that followed were a blur of fragmented thoughts and shadows that didn't belong. I couldn't sleep, not in the way I once understood it. When I closed my eyes, the whispers filled the void, weaving visions of places I'd never been, and horrors I couldn't comprehend. My hand, the one marked by the wreck, tingled constantly, like an itch beneath the skin that I could never quite scratch. I kept to myself. People noticed. Email be soon, but sty. Friends, colleagues, they all asked the same questions. Are you feeling okay? You've been distant. Their words barely registered. How could I explain what was happening when I didn't even understand it myself? The shadows moved differently now. Slower in the daylight, but frenetic at night. They had form and weight, and sometimes I could swear they were watching me. The first real sign of what I'd brought back came 3 nights after I left the wreck. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the air shifted. It wasn't the subtle movement of a breeze, but something more deliberate, like a presence settling into the room. My breathing quickened, the stillness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The light from the street lamp outside cast faint lines across the walls, but they weren't enough to illuminate the corners, which now seemed impossibly dark. The shadows stretched and curled toward the center of the room, converging into something solid, something alive. I froze, my mind screaming at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The form in the darkness coalesced. A figure, faceless, yet unmistakably human in shape. It stood at the edge of the bed, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, as though studying me. "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It was the only word I could manage, though I wasn't sure who or what I was asking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it leaned closer. The void, where its face should have been hovering just inches from mine. The whispers surged, louder and more chaotic than ever, filling my mind until I thought it might split open. And then it was gone. Just like that, the air returned to normal, the oppressive weight lifting. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my body finally free to move. I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with warm light, but the shadows had already retreated. The only evidence that anything had happened was the faint hum in my marked hand, the glow of the symbols just barely visible beneath my skin. The next day, I told myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination, perhaps brought on by stress or sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew better. The wreck had changed something fundamental about me, about the world around me. The boundaries between reality and whatever lay beyond it were thinning, and I was at the center of it. I decided to return to the wreck. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay there, waiting, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a sense of dread. I made my way to the shoreline. The tide was low, revealing jagged rocks and seaweed that clung to the remnants of the old ship. The air was colder here, sharper, as though the place itself resented my presence. The wreck loomed ahead, its twisted beams silhouetted against the moonlit sky. As I approached, the whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging me forward. I stepped inside, the same chill running down my spine as the first time. The carvings were still there, glowing faintly, their patterns even more intricate than I remembered. The air felt alive, thrumming with an energy that resonated in my chest. I followed the path deeper into the wreck, the same way I had before, but this time I knew where it led. The pedestal stood in the center of the chamber, but the box was gone. In its place was something new, a pool of inky black liquid, its surface rippling as though it were breathing. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their urgency impossible to ignore. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the edge of the pool. I stared into its depths, my reflection distorted and fragmented. The markings on my hand began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the liquid's rhythm. "Take it back," a voice whispered, clear and cold. It wasn't like the others. It was singular, directed. I didn't know what it meant, but my body did. My marked hand moved toward the pool, the symbols on my skin burning as they touched the surface. The liquid wasn't cold or warm. It was nothingness, a void that defied comprehension. Pain shot through me as the liquid climbed my arm, wrapping around me like tendrils. My mind screamed, but my body stayed rooted in place. The wreck seemed to pulse with life, the carvings glowing so brightly they illuminated the entire chamber. The shadows danced on the walls, their shapes twisting into forms I couldn't recognize. And then it was over. The liquid retreated, leaving my skin unmarked. The symbols gone. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The wreck, once alive with energy, felt empty, abandoned. I stumbled backward, my legs barely able to support me. Whatever had happened, the wreck had given me something, or taken something from me. As I made my way back to the shore, I glanced at my hand, now unmarked. But the silence in my mind wasn't comforting. It was ominous, a warning of what was yet to come. The days following my return from the wreck were an unrelenting cascade of inexplicable events. The silence in my mind had been far from a reprieve. It was like a predator waiting in the shadows, coiled and patient, daring me to step too close. I didn't speak of it to anyone. Not the disappearance of the markings, not the black liquid, and certainly not the voice that had commanded me to take it back. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know, but it wanted me to know. The first sign of its return was subtle, a sound in the night, like something dragging itself across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old homes creak. It's what they do. But as the noise continued, it became impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just random creaks and groans. It was deliberate, a series of slow, rhythmic movements that circled my bedroom, like a predator stalking its prey. I stayed frozen in bed, the blankets pulled tightly around me, as if they could protect me from whatever was out there. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, that my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me. But when the noise stopped and the air in the room shifted, I knew better. The room grew colder, so cold that my breath became visible in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. I could feel it before I saw it. The presence, heavy, oppressive, and unrelenting. It wasn't just in the room. It was everywhere. The walls seemed to bend under its weight, the shadows writhing as though alive. And then it appeared. It started in the corner, a ripple in the darkness that quickly expanded, unfolding into a shape that defied logic. Its form was human but fractured, as though it was only pretending to be one. Limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its head tilted in a way that made my stomach churn. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there like a statue, but my body refused to move, held in place by an invisible force that felt like a hand wrapped around my chest. The thing stepped closer, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on me until it felt like my lungs might collapse. "You brought it back," the voice from the wreck whispered. Though its lips didn't move, the sound wasn't just in the room. It was in my head, threading through my thoughts like poison. "You've opened the door." I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't need to. The thing standing before me was proof enough. Endily, whatever I had disturbed in that wreck, whatever I had taken, it wasn't going to let me go. It leaned closer, its void-like face mere inches from mine. The smell of decay filled my nostrils, and for a moment I thought I might faint, and then it was gone, just like that. The oppressive weight lifted, and the room returned to its normal state. The cold receded, the shadows stilled, and the air no longer felt like it was suffocating me. But I wasn't alone. A single word had been carved into the wall above my bed, etched deep into the plaster. Return. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing's twisted form, heard its voice echoing in my head. By morning, I had made my decision. I needed answers. The wreck had taken something from me, my peace of mind, my sense of safety, but it had also left something behind. The voice, the whispers, the thing in my room. They all pointed to the same conclusion. I couldn't run from this. Not anymore. I returned to the shore at dawn, the tide low, and the wreck looming like a skeleton against the gray horizon. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. But I forced myself to keep walking. The whispers returned as soon as I stepped onto the sand, faint but persistent, like a warning I couldn't quite hear. The wreck was exactly as I had left it, the broken beams casting long shadows across the rocky shore. But as I approached, I noticed something new. The carvings on the wood, those strange glowing symbols, had spread. They now covered nearly every surface, pulsing faintly like veins, carrying blood to some unseen heart. The whispers grew louder as I stepped inside, the air thick with the same oppressive energy I had felt in my room. The pedestal was still there, but the pool of black liquid was gone. In its place was something far worse. A figure standing motionless in the center of the chamber. It was the same thing I had seen in my room. Its fractured form, somehow more horrific in the dim light of the wreck. "You cannot undo what's been done," it said, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "But you can finish what you started." I wanted to ask what it meant, but the words caught in my throat. The thing extended a hand, its long, gnarled fingers pointing to the pedestal. My marked hand, the one that had once glowed with the wreck symbols, began to burn, the pain searing and unrelenting. It was a command, not a choice. As I stepped closer, the carvings on the pedestal began to glow brighter, their light almost blinding. The air around me seemed to hum with energy, the sound vibrating in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling as it made contact with the cold ancient wood. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in the wreck anymore. I wasn't even sure I was still in the real world. The air was thick, damp, and cold, clinging to my skin like a second layer. A fog stretched endlessly in all directions, swallowing the ground, the sky, and any sense of orientation. My legs felt heavy, as if the fog itself was weighing me down, and every breath I took felt like inhaling shards of ice. The only sound was the slow, deliberate dripping of water, echoing somewhere in the distance. The silence between each drop was deafening, stretching so long that it felt like time itself had stopped. My head pounded with every echo, a rhythmic reminder that I didn't belong here. I clutched my temples, trying to force my thoughts into coherence, but they scattered like ash in the wind. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, the same twisted, fractured thing that had haunted my room and the wreck. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, its limbs bending and snapping as it approached. But this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows rippled behind it, multiplying, merging and splitting again, as if the fog itself was alive. Faces formed briefly in the mist, eyes wide with terror, and mouths agape in silent screams before they dissolved into nothingness. The thing's voice didn't come from its blank, void-like face, but from everywhere at once. It was a whisper and a roar, a sound that made my bones ache and my teeth vibrate. "You took what was not yours," it said, "and now you must give." My heart sank as I realized it wasn't just speaking to me. The shadows in the fog moved closer, and I could feel them pressing against my skin, cold and suffocating. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. "For what?" I whispered, though my voice barely carried beyond my own ears. The thing extended its gnarled hand, pointing to the ground beneath me. I looked down and saw the symbols from the wreck carved into the soil, glowing faintly with the same eerie light. They formed a circle around me, their shapes shifting and rearranging like a living thing. My marked hand began to burn again, the pain so intense that I fell to my knees. "You are the bridge," it said. "The door must open." I didn't understand what it meant, but the symbols did. They pulsed faster, their light growing brighter, until it felt like I was standing in the center of a sun. The ground beneath me trembled, and cracks began to spiderweb outward from the circle, glowing with a molten, otherworldly light. The air grew hotter, the cold fog replaced by a suffocating heat that made my skin feel like it was melting. And then the ground gave way. I fell, tumbling through darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The heat disappeared, replaced by a cold so profound that it felt like my blood was freezing in my veins. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world was nothing but an endless void, swallowing me whole. When I landed, it wasn't on solid ground. It was something softer, wetter, and disturbingly alive. The ground pulsed beneath me like the heartbeat of a massive creature, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling as I tried to steady myself. But the place was impossible. Above me, a sky of swirling black and red moved as if it were a living entity, the clouds forming grotesque shapes that twisted and writhed before dissolving into nothingness. The horizon was a jagged line of obsidian spires, each one glowing faintly with the same light as the symbols. And in the center of it all was the pedestal. It was larger now, towering above me like a monument to some forgotten god. The carvings on its surface were no longer static. They moved and shifted, the shapes writhing as if they were alive. The black liquid from before now flowed from the pedestal like a river, pooling around its base before snaking outward in all directions. I didn't want to approach it, but I didn't have a choice. My marked hand burned with an intensity that left me gasping for air, and I knew that whatever was happening here wouldn't stop until I obeyed. My steps were slow, each one heavier than the last, as if the air itself was fighting to hold me back. When I reached the pedestal, the liquid began to rise, forming a column that stretched upward until it was level with my chest. A shape began to emerge from it, a small, twisted object that pulsed with the same eerie light as the symbols. It was the thing I had taken from the wreck, the thing I hadn't even realized I'd taken. The column dissolved, leaving the object hovering in the air before me. It was grotesque, a mass of sharp edges and impossible angles that seemed to defy logic. My marked hand moved on its own, reaching out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, the world exploded. Light and sound enveloped me, a cacophony of screams and whispers that threatened to tear me apart. The ground beneath me disappeared, and I was floating, suspended in a void of blinding light and deafening noise. Images flashed before my eyes. Faces, places, moments that weren't mine, but felt as if they had been burned into my soul. The object melted into my hand, its edges slicing into my flesh as it merged with me. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't scream. The light and sound swallowed everything, leaving nothing but the overwhelming sensation of something ancient and powerful taking root inside me. When the world returned, I was no longer in the strange, pulsing landscape. I was back on the shore, the wreck looming in the distance. Penguiksdal. Blue. The air was still, the sky gray, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the rocks. But I wasn't alone. The thing stood behind me, its fractured form more solid now, more defined. Its void-like face turned toward me, and for the first time I saw something in the darkness. Eyes, my eyes, you are the bridge. It said again, and the doors open. The wreck groaned, its beams creaking as something massive stirred within. I turned to run, but the thing grabbed my arm, its grip cold and unyielding. There is no escape, it whispered. Not anymore. Lulil hided. The world around me began to warp, the sky melting into itself, like paint swirling in water. The wreck was no longer just a shattered husk of wood and iron. It was alive. Tendrils of blackened timber stretched upward, clawing at the heavens as the groaning and creaking of its structure grew louder. Each movement carried an otherworldly hum, a vibration that burrowed deep into my chest and rattled my very bones. The thing gripping my arm didn't loosen its hold, its touch ice cold and burning at the same time. My breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. I tried to pull away, but its grip only tightened, an unspoken warning coursing through the touch. You can't leave. It hissed, the voice crawling into my ears and embedding itself in my skull. Not until the bridge is complete. The ground beneath me shifted, cracks forming in the rocky shore, and bleeding a viscous, black liquid. I felt it seep around my shoes, thick and warm, like blood. The liquid bubbled and hissed, carrying with it an acrid stench that clawed at the back of my throat. I didn't know what it meant to complete the bridge, but I could feel it, deep in the pit of my stomach. A pull, a command that wasn't mine yet felt intrinsic to my very being. My marked hand throbbed, the glowing symbols searing into my flesh like molten metal. They pulsed in rhythm with the vibrations from the wreck. Sensing, merging, the wreck spoke, not with words, but with sound. A guttural moan that resonated through the air and the earth, filling every inch of space. The tendrils of wood twisted together, forming a grotesque spire that reached higher and higher, its jagged edges piercing the clouds. At the base of the wreck, something shifted. The black liquid pooled together, rising into a single massive form that began to take shape. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood life. Its surface was smooth, reflective, yet constantly shifting like a black mirror in motion. It had no face, no discernible features, but I could feel its gaze. It bore into me, stripping me down to my very essence. You are the key. The thing at my side whispered, releasing my arm and stepping back. Its fractured body melded into the wreck, becoming one with the pulsing mass of wood and iron. You brought this upon yourself. Engel, you brought this upon yourself. The memories I didn't want to confront, the mistakes I had buried, they surged forward, images flashing before me in vivid, unbearable clarity. Every lie, every moment of selfishness, every act of harm I had caused, they were all there, parading in front of me like a judgment I couldn't escape. The black figure extended what I could only assume was an arm, a long, twisting appendage that stretched toward me. I tried to back away, but the liquid beneath my feet held me in place. The symbols on my hand burned brighter, the pain shooting up my arm and into my chest. "You will give," it said, its voice not a sound but a sensation, vibrating through my mind and soul. "What you owe." The pull in my chest became unbearable, like a thread being yanked free from the fabric of my being. My knees buckled, and I fell into the liquid, its warmth enveloping me. It wasn't water. It was something alive, something ancient and knowing. It whispered to me, voices overlapping in a cacophony that spoke of regret, pain, and surrender. I screamed, my voice lost in the tide of whispers. As the liquid began to seep into my skin, my body burned. Every nerve alight with a pain so profound, it was almost transcendent. The symbols on my hand spread, the glowing lines snaking up my arm, my neck, and over my face. They weren't just markings. They were a language, a story, and I was the final chapter. The black figure loomed closer, its presence all-consuming. It knelt before me, its featureless face inches from mine. I saw myself in its surface, not as I was, but as I could have been. It showed me a version of myself free from guilt, free from pain. And then it shattered the image with a single chilling word. Accept. The wreck behind it groaned louder, the spire now complete and pulsing with an eerie light. The ground trembled as the black liquid surged upward, forming a massive wave that hovered above us, ready to crash down and consume everything. And then I let go. The pull in my chest snapped, and I felt myself unraveling. My memories, my fears, my very identity. They poured out of me and into the figure, who drank them in like a starving beast. The symbols on my body burned brighter, their light flooding the darkness until there was nothing but white. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the shore. The wreck was gone. The black liquid, the spire, the figure. Everything had vanished, leaving nothing but silence and the soft lapping of the waves. But I wasn't the same. The symbols were still there, etched into my skin, their light faint but constant. My marked hand no longer hurt, but it felt heavy, as if it carried something far greater than I could comprehend. The air was still, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone, or so I thought. In the distance, where the wreck had once been, a figure stood. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. It raised its hand, mirroring my movements perfectly, before turning and walking into the horizon. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the shore, staring at the water as the sun rose above the waves. For the first time I understood what the thing had meant. I was the bridge, and the door was still open. Elufiliumi, Stella. I remember every second of the drive into that godforsaken town. The Appalachian roads twisted like veins through the dense, shadowed forest, the mist curling through the pines as if it were alive. Ah, the closer I got, the heavier my chest felt, like some unseen hand was pressing down, urging me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was no logical reason for me to be there. I had never heard of Black Hollow before the dreams started, vivid and suffocating. Each night, I woke drenched in sweat, the same voice whispering a name in my ear, Black Hollow. I tried ignoring it at first, but the dreams became relentless, the whispers louder. That's how I ended up on that desolate road, the fuel gauge on my car dipping toward empty as the town came into view. Black Hollow looked like it had been carved out of another era. The buildings leaned against one another like weary drunks, their paint peeled and windows boarded. The air was thick with damp rot, and even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. I parked on the main street, stepping out into the eerie quiet. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the cracked asphalt, as though the town were listening. The first sign that something was wrong came within minutes, as I stood in front of what looked like an old general store. I heard the faint sound of children laughing. It wasn't the playful, innocent kind of laughter. It was distant, hollow, as if it came from deep within the ground. I spun around, searching for its source, but the street was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I noticed the door to the store, swinging open, creaking on rusted hinges. My gut screamed at me to leave, but my legs carried me forward, the compulsion impossible to resist. Inside, the store was an abandoned wreck. Dust coated every surface, the shelves sagging under the weight of neglect. But it wasn't empty. Scrawled on the walls in what looked like ash were words, repeated over and over. They see. The phrase covered nearly every inch of the space, overlapping in a chaotic, frenzied pattern. I traced one of the lines with my finger, the ash smudging under my touch. That's when I heard it. A breath, hot and damp against the back of my neck, whipping around. I found nothing. The store was as lifeless as before. But now the air felt heavier, as though something unseen was crowding the space around me. My pulse thundered as I backed out of the store, my hands trembling. Outside, the sky had darkened unnaturally fast. The sun, which had been high when I arrived, was now swallowed by an ominous, shifting gray. That's when I saw it. Across the street, by what looked like a church, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and wrong, like a grotesque parody of a human silhouette, its head tilted to one side as if observing me. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its gaze burrow into me, cold and invasive. My instincts screamed for me to run, but my body was frozen. Then it moved, not like a person, but with a jerky, disjointed motion, as though it was being puppeteered by something clumsy. It didn't walk toward me, but seemed to glide, its feet never touching the ground. The air grew colder with each inch it closed between us. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing from every direction. I bolted without thinking, my legs finally responding. I didn't stop until I was inside the nearest building, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. The room was pitch black, but I could feel it, the presence. I wasn't alone. Hi. The soft scratching sound started, faint but steady. It came from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was as if dozens of nails were dragging against the wood, closing in. I fumbled for my phone, the glow of its screen illuminating the space. The room was empty, but the shadows, they moved. They didn't retreat from the light like normal shadows. Instead, they writhed, creeping toward me, forming shapes, faces contorted in silent screams, hands reaching out as if to drag me into the darkness. The scratching intensified, becoming a deafening cacophony. And then the whispers began. They weren't words, not exactly, but sounds that burrowed into my skull, chaotic and nonsensical. They were coming from everywhere, nowhere, and inside me all at once. I dropped the phone in my panic, the screen shattering against the floor, plunging the room into complete darkness. That's when I felt them. Edu. Freisul. Fingers. Not human fingers, but cold, spindly things curling around my wrist. I screamed, yanking my arm away, but they didn't let go. A weight settled on my chest, crushing and suffocating. My vision blurred as the air was sucked from my lungs. Just as I thought I would pass out, the weight vanished. The whispers stopped. The scratching ceased. I was alone again. The silence almost more terrifying than the noise. My phone buzzed faintly on the ground, the shattered screen casting a fractured light. On it was a single message, written in the same ash as the words in the store. You were chosen. The air was no longer still. It was alive, humming with an unnatural energy. And deep down I knew I wasn't getting out of Black Hollow alive. I don't remember leaving the building. It's like my body moved without my brain registering it, dragging me back into the open air of Black Hollow's desolate streets. The world outside wasn't any safer. The sky was darker now, the clouds churning in unnatural spirals, and the oppressive quiet had grown suffocating. There was no wind, no sound of birds or insects, just the eerie stillness of a place that didn't want to be disturbed. Every instinct told me, "Here, get in the car, drive as fast as possible, and never look back." But my legs wouldn't carry me to the vehicle. And my chest felt tight, as though invisible strings were pulling me deeper into the heart of the town. I turned onto a narrow alley between two sagging buildings, the walls closing in as if the town itself were alive, reshaping to trap me. Ahead, the ground was littered with torn scraps of paper. Waves in there. They were stained, some with water, and others with a darker rust-colored substance that I didn't want to think about. I picked one up without meaning to. The compulsion overwhelming. The words on the page were scrawled in the same frantic handwriting I'd seen in the store. They are watching. Don't trust the mirrors. Mirrors? I instinctively glanced around, searching for anything reflective. The alley was empty, except for the scraps. But the oppressive feeling didn't leave. It clung to my skin, heavier. With each passing second, I kept moving, my footsteps echoing against the brick walls. The further I went, the more disjointed everything felt. The ground was uneven, as though the very fabric of reality had been warped. The buildings leaned in strange directions, their windows yawning open like gaping mouths. One had a faint glow inside, a flickering light that shouldn't have been possible given the town's obvious state of decay. The door to the glowing building creaked open as I approached. Again, I wasn't in control. My feet crossed the threshold, and I was hit by a wave of heat. The air was stifling, thick with the metallic scent of burning. Inside was a long hallway, its walls lined with shattered mirrors, their jagged edges catching the faint light. Every shard reflected something different. None of them showed my face. One shard showed the church from earlier, but now it was engulfed in flame. Another reflected a dense forest, the trees writhing like they were alive. Envelop house, but the largest shard, the one directly in front of me, showed something far worse. It was me, but not me. My reflection stood in the middle of the hallway, staring back with empty eyes, its head tilted, mirroring the figure I'd seen outside the church. And then, it smiled. The smile wasn't human. It stretched too far, splitting the face until it was no longer recognizable. I stumbled back, my heart hammering as the reflection stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. The shards around it began to hum, a low vibration that grew louder and louder until the sound was unbearable. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly. The mirrors multiplied, their shards lining every inch of the walls and ceiling. My distorted reflection was everywhere, each version worse than the last. Some were laughing, others screaming, but they all stared at me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. A voice broke through the cacophony, low and guttural, yet somehow familiar. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. The words weren't spoken aloud. They echoed inside my head, reverberating through my skull. I clenched my fists, desperate to block it out, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. "You were warned. Now, you belong to us. Belong." Hana. My breath hitched as the temperature dropped suddenly, frost creeping across the floorboards. The shards of the mirrors began to fall, their edges slicing through the air like razors. One grazed my arm, drawing blood. The pain snapped me out of my stupor. and I bolted toward the only door visible at the end of the hallway. I didn't look back, but I could feel them following. Envelop, unsettling, the reflections, the voices, the shadows. They all chased me, their presence a tangible weight, pressing against my back. When I reached the door, it didn't open into the street, as I'd hoped. Instead, it led to a room that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in more writing, not just in ash, but in blood. The words were chaotic, overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. In the center of the room was a single chair, its wooden frame splintered and stained. Ropes dangled from its arms, and around it, candles burned in a perfect circle. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. The candles flared, their flames stretching impossibly high. The shadows cast by the light writhed and twisted, forming shapes, faces, hands, bodies. They moved toward the chair, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. Then the figure from outside the church appeared. It emerged from the largest shadow, its head tilted, limbs contorted. It didn't speak, but its presence said everything. I was trapped, and it was here for me. The chair creaked, as though it were waiting. The shadows pressed closer, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees. The figure loomed above me, its empty gaze locking onto mine. And then I heard the voice again. "You're one of us now." The echo of the voice lingered, etched into my mind, growing heavier with every passing second. My knees pressed against the cold floor of the darkened room, and the air around me felt oppressive, suffocating. The flickering candlelight threw eerie shadows across the walls, warping the figure before me into something otherworldly. Its movements were disjointed, unnatural, like a puppet bound to invisible strings. The chair in the center of the room creaked again, its worn wood groaning as if alive. My chest tightened as an inexplicable force drew me toward it. It wasn't the chair itself. It was the aura surrounding it, a palpable darkness that seemed to whisper promises and warnings all at once. My legs felt like they were no longer my own, compelled forward by something unseen. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, shifting and curling around me like smoke. My every step felt heavier than the last, as though I were walking through deep water. The flickering candlelight dimmed, their small flames shrinking as the room grew colder. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, echoing in the oppressive silence. I stumbled toward the chair, my hand brushing against its surface. The moment I touched it, a wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't the kind of sickness that came from within. It felt external, like the chair itself was rejecting me, even as it pulled me closer. The air buzzed with an energy that prickled my skin, and I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run. But the room offered no escape. The door I'd entered through was gone, replaced by an expanse of darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely. The figure in the shadows tilted its head, observing me with a stillness that was unnerving. It didn't speak, but its presence filled the room with unspoken intent. The shadows writhed at its feet, slithering toward me, forming a circle around the chair. My knees buckled as I felt their pull, and before I knew it, I was seated, the ropes wrapping around me like vines. They weren't physical ropes, at least not entirely. They felt like manifestations of the oppressive energy in the room, binding me as though I were part of the ritual. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and changing as it approached. Its outline seemed human, but its movements betrayed something far more sinister. It extended a hand, and the shadows around me tightened, holding me in place. My mind screamed for release, but my body refused to move. The air buzzed louder, a cacophony of whispers filling the space, each voice indistinct but chilling. The candles flared suddenly, their flames leaping higher and casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. In the wavering light, I caught glimpses of images, symbols etched into the wood of the chair, marks that seemed ancient and malevolent. They pulsed with a faint glow, as though responding to the energy in the room. A reflection appeared in the darkness before me, shimmering as though cast on the surface of still water. It was me, but not me. The figure staring back had hollow eyes, its face contorted in a way that made my stomach churn. The longer I stared, the more the reflection moved on its own, independent of my actions. It raised a hand, beckoning me forward, though I was already immobile. The oppressive energy in the room grew sharper, cutting through my thoughts and replacing them with visions. They weren't memories, at least not ones I recognized. They were flashes of places I'd never been, events I'd never witnessed. A forest blanketed in fog, a decaying house perched on a cliff's edge, an empty street under a blood-red sky. Each image lingered just long enough to seep into my consciousness before fading into the next. The figure in the shadows finally spoke, its voice low and resonant, reverberating through the air. "Do you see?" it asked, though the question felt more like a statement. "This is what awaits." The vision shifted again, this time to a small, dimly lit room. The flickering light revealed a figure slumped in the corner, unmoving. I squinted, and my heart sank as I recognized the face. It was mine, or at least a version of me. The figure was pale, drained of life, its eyes fixed in a blank stare. My stomach twisted as the realization set in. I was looking at a possibility, a fragment of what could be. The shadows tightened around me, pulling me back into the present. The figure in the room loomed closer, its head tilting once more as it observed me. "The choice is yours," it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. The ropes around me loosened slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a warning. The oppressive darkness began to recede, replaced by the faint glow of the candles, their light steadying as the shadows drew back. The air in the room shifted. The figure stepped away, disappearing into the inky blackness beyond the circle of candles. I was left alone in the chair. The marks beneath me still pulsing faintly, their energy lingering like an echo. My breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the moment settled on me. Whatever had transpired, it wasn't over. The room might have released me, but the lingering presence of the figure and the visions it had shown me remained etched into my mind. The air was colder now, and the damp chill seeped into my bones as I stood motionless in the center of the room. The flickering light of the single candle on the table barely pierced the oppressive darkness around me. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't empty, it was alive. A faint hum filled the space, vibrating in the walls, in the floor beneath me. And even in the air, I struggled to breathe. I didn't know where the door had gone, or if it had ever been there to begin with. The walls seemed to have shifted, pressing closer, warping the space into something unrecognizable. The chair I had been bound to earlier stood empty, its carved symbols glowing faintly in the dim light, as though it had absorbed the events that had transpired moments ago. Or was it hours ago? Time no longer felt linear. It was slipping through my grasp like sand. My legs trembled as I took a hesitant step forward, my shoes scraping against the uneven floor, which now seemed jagged and alive with faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Then a sound, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. It came from the shadows, from somewhere beyond the weak halo of candlelight. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, evolving into something more defined, a low, guttural rasp, like breathing but distorted. I froze, my instincts screaming at me to stay perfectly still, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there had already noticed me. I turned toward the sound, my every muscle tensed, ready to flee, even though there was nowhere to go. The shadows rippled, and something began to take shape. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form indistinct, but undeniably alive. My breath hitched as two pinpricks of light emerged within the darkness. Eyes. They weren't human. They burned with an otherworldly intensity, piercing through the gloom and locking onto me with predatory intent. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the uneven floor, and I fell hard. The impact sent the candle toppling off the table, its flame extinguished as it hit the ground. Darkness consumed the room, and panic rose in my chest like a tidal wave. I scrambled to my feet, my hands searching frantically for the table, the chair, anything that could anchor me. But the room had changed again, the walls now impossibly far away, the floor stretching out beneath me like an endless void. The breathing grew louder, closer. It was behind me now. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, nothing I could see anyway. The air shifted, brushing against the back of my neck like a cold whisper, and I could feel it, something massive, something ancient. Its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me with a weight that threatened to crush me. Then a voice. low and guttural. It echoed in the space around me, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "You've seen the beginning," it said, each word drawn out, dripping with malice. "Now, witness the end." The floor beneath me lurched violently, and I was thrown off balance, falling into the void. My scream was swallowed by the darkness as I plummeted, the air rushing past me in a deafening roar. I fell for what felt like an eternity, until finally I hit solid ground with a force that knocked a breath from my lungs. The impact left me dazed, my body aching as I tried to push myself up. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the room. I was outside, standing in a desolate landscape under a blood-red sky. The ground was cracked and barren, stretching out endlessly in every direction. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, their shapes indistinct but menacing. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the silence was broken only by the faint echoes of distant screams. In the distance, a structure loomed, a crumbling tower of black stone that seemed to pulsate with a sinister energy. I didn't want to go toward it, but I had no choice. The shadows around me began to close in, forcing me forward. With each step, the ground beneath me felt more unstable, as though it might collapse at any moment. The screams grew louder, merging into a cacophony that seemed to come from within the tower. And as I approached, the door to the tower creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers I had heard earlier returned, this time louder, more insistent. I hesitated, my mind racing with the knowledge that whatever was down there would be far worse than anything I had already encountered. But the shadows behind me left no room for hesitation, their presence pushing me forward until I was standing at the edge of the staircase. I took the first step, and the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the staircase into complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the narrow space, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. My hands grazed the cold, damp walls as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the unknown. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and a sense of dread settled over me like a suffocating weight. Finally, I reached the bottom. The staircase opened into a cavernous chamber, dimly lit by a faint, pulsing light that emanated from the walls themselves. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, its back turned to me. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements unnervingly fluid. The whispers stopped abruptly as the figure turned to face me, its featureless face tilting as though it were studying me. My body froze, paralyzed by an unseen force. The figure extended a hand, and the pulsing light intensified, filling the chamber with an unbearable brightness. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure's face, or what should have been its face. It was a void, an endless abyss that seemed to consume everything around it. Then there was nothing. The cavern's brightness consumed me, Yet the void in the figure's face seemed to stretch infinitely, pulling at my very consciousness. When my senses returned, or at least what remained of them, I found myself lying on a cold metallic floor. The air was sterile and faintly humming, like some machine was breathing in the shadows. My head pounded as I sat up, struggling to understand where I was. The chamber was gone, and so was the figure. Instead, I was surrounded by towering walls of steel, lined with blinking lights and strange, incomprehensible symbols etched into their surfaces. The space pulsed faintly, almost as though the walls themselves were alive. Every pulse sent a wave of nausea through my body, as if my very existence was misaligned with this place. I pushed myself to my feet, unsteady, but determined to move. There were no visible doors, only the endless stretch of glowing panels and cold steel. My breaths came shallow, the sterile air cutting into my lungs. I stumbled forward, unsure if I was even moving at all. Everything around me looked the same, the patterns of lights repeating infinitely. It was disorienting, a labyrinth without walls, and the pulsing only grew louder, like a heartbeat reverberating in my ears. Then came the voice. Amwave. It was soft at first, an almost soothing hum that wrapped around my mind like a warm blanket, but its tone carried something else, something invasive, prying into the corners of my thoughts. You still think this is yours? The question hit me like a jolt of electricity. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't external. It was inside me, speaking directly into my mind. I tried to push it away, to shut it out, but it only grew stronger. What you see, what you feel, even your fear, it's borrowed. You don't belong here, yet you've always been here. The words twisted in my head, unraveling my thoughts. I staggered backward, my shoulder colliding with one of the walls. The moment my skin touched the steel, the symbols flared to life, brighter than the sun, and I was pulled into another vision. It wasn't like the others. This one was more vivid, more tangible. I was standing in a sprawling city of black spires and endless skies, painted in shades of green and gray. The ground beneath me shifted, alive with tendrils of shadow that slithered and coiled, as if they were searching for something or someone. The people, or at least what passed for people here, moved silently through the city, their forms indistinct, their faces shrouded in mist. They didn't seem to notice me, or perhaps they couldn't. I was an intruder in their world, and yet I felt a strange familiarity, as though I had been here before. The voice returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't inside my head. It was all around me, echoing through the city like a chorus of whispers. This is what you've forgotten. The city shifted, dissolving into fragments of light and shadow. My stomach churned as the world collapsed around me, pulling me through a torrent of distorted images and sounds. Faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew, places that felt like home, yet were completely alien, and a sensation of falling deeper and deeper into an abyss. When the chaos stopped, I was back in the steel labyrinth, gasping for air. My body ached as though I had been physically torn apart and stitched back together. The walls pulsed again, this time with a sharper rhythm, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Ahead of me, the labyrinth opened into a massive chamber, its size incomprehensible. At its center was a structure, a pillar of glowing, pulsating light that stretched into the void above. The hum of the labyrinth intensified, and I felt drawn to the pillar, as though it was calling to me. Every step toward it felt like a battle against my own body. My legs grew heavier, my chest tighter. The closer I got, the more the whispers returned, louder and more aggressive. They overlapped, creating a cacophony of voices, each one clawing at my mind, trying to pull me apart. I reached the pillar, my trembling hand extending toward its surface. The light was blinding, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just light, it was alive, pulsating with an energy that defied comprehension. My fingers brushed against it, and everything stopped. The whispers, the pulsing, the hum, all of it vanished in an instant. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, the truth revealed itself. The pillar wasn't a source of power or knowledge. It was a prison, and the thing it contained, the thing I had been running from, searching for, was me. I stared into the light, and it stared back, a mirror reflecting not my physical form, but something deeper, the shadows I had seen in the city, the figure in the void, the labyrinth itself. They were all fragments of me, pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I had been solving. "You've come full circle," the voice said, no longer invasive, but resigned, almost mournful. "Now, you must decide, to become whole or to let it end." The light began to fracture, cracks spreading through its surface. The chamber shook, and I felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. To reach out and embrace it would mean surrendering to the unknown, to lose myself entirely in whatever this was. Yeah, but to turn away would mean walking back into the labyrinth, into the endless cycle of fear and confusion. I stood there, torn between two impossible choices, as the light grew brighter, threatening to consume everything. And then, El Hanidu Sil. And then, the light fractured, its shards raining down in brilliant cascading fragments, each piece reflecting something different. Memories I had buried, places I had never seen, and faces I couldn't place but knew with an aching familiarity. I could feel the vibrations of the collapsing chamber coursing through my body. Each pulse felt like it was tearing apart whatever tethered me to reality. I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes as the glow intensified. Yet, even through the chaos, I could feel the pull, an irresistible gravity dragging me toward the fractured remnants of the pillar. It wasn't just the room collapsing. It was everything. The walls of steel bent and warped, twisting into impossible shapes, as though the labyrinth itself was revolting against me. The voices returned, louder than ever. And this time, they weren't just whispers. They screamed, their cries an unrelenting storm of demands, accusations, and pleas. You don't belong here. Why did you come back? Finish what you started. The cacophony threatened to break me. But amidst the storm, a single voice rose above the others. It was calm, deliberate, and entirely inhuman. This is your consequence. The glow from the shattered pillar surged, and in that moment, the world split apart. I was weightless, caught in a swirling torrent of light and darkness, my body disintegrating into fragments that spiraled away into the void. There was no time, no space, only the overwhelming sensation of falling forever. When I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. The sterile steel labyrinth was gone, replaced by a dense forest, drenched in an otherworldly twilight. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the ground beneath me pulsed faintly, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Shadows moved in the periphery, their shapes indistinct but undeniably watching me. The forest wasn't real, or at least, not entirely. It felt like a reflection, a place conjured from memories warped and stretched until they were almost unrecognizable. The trees were too tall, their branches bending at unnatural angles. The ground was littered with objects I couldn't quite identify but felt disturbingly familiar. Broken trinkets, torn pieces of fabric, shards of glass, reflecting a sky that wasn't there. I walked forward, though I couldn't tell if I was moving towards something, or if the forest was rearranging itself around me. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the distance. As I pressed deeper into the woods, I saw it, a house standing in the clearing. It was old, its wooden exterior rotting and covered in a tangled web of vines. The windows were dark, but I could feel the house watching me, its presence a living, breathing thing that loomed over the forest. I didn't want to go inside, but my feet carried me forward, compelled by a force I couldn't resist. The door creaked open as I approached, as though the house had been waiting for me. The interior was shrouded in shadow, the air thick with the scent of decay. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a hallway lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. From within the rooms came faint sounds, whispers, laughter, crying, each one more unsettling than the last. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening as the door slammed shut behind me. The sound reverberated through the house, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air grew colder, and I could feel something moving in the shadows, circling me, watching me. The hallway stretched endlessly, the doors multiplying with each step I took. I reached out to one of them, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. Inside was a room that shouldn't exist. It was my childhood bedroom, perfectly preserved, down to the smallest detail. The posters on the wall, the worn-out carpet, the books stacked haphazardly on the desk. It was all there, untouched by time, but it wasn't right. The colors were too vivid, the edges too sharp, like a photograph that had been overexposed. And in the center of the room was a figure, sitting on the bed with its back to me. Its silhouette was wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. It turned slowly, and my stomach dropped as I saw its face. It was me, or at least it was wearing my face. Its eyes were hollow voids, its smile stretched too wide. It spoke, its voice, a distorted echo of my own. Why did you leave us? I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and breaking into a run. The hallway twisted and shifted, the doors slamming open and shut as though the house itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, blending into screams that followed me as I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was no escape. The hallway looped endlessly, the house warping around me until I wasn't sure which way was up. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. Ah, Sul, Sel. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. I was standing in a large, empty room, its walls lined with mirrors. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, each one slightly off. My expression wrong, my movements delayed. The voice returned, calm and deliberate. You can't run from this. In the center of the room stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It raised an arm, and the mirrors cracked, the sound like thunder. My reflections shattered, each shard showing something different. My face, my life, my fears, all distorted, broken pieces of who I was. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. It extended a hand, and in it was a single shard of glass, its surface reflecting nothing but darkness. Take it, the voice said. It's the only way. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the shard. I could feel the weight of the decision, the inevitability of it. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The shard hovered in the air between us, its edges gleaming like the teeth of some ancient predator. My hand trembled as I reached out, but every instinct screamed at me to stop. This wasn't just a choice. It was a surrender, an admission of something I wasn't ready to confront. But then again, hadn't everything I'd seen, everything I'd endured, already stripped me down to my core? The voice inside whispered, urging me forward, telling me this was the only way to end the nightmare. I grasped the shard. The room didn't explode or collapse. Instead, it dissolved into blackness, a void that swallowed everything, leaving me suspended in an endless abyss. The silence was unbearable, pressing into my ears like a scream I couldn't hear. I stared into the shard, its surface alive with writhing shadows and flickering images. They were scenes from my life. Or maybe they weren't. Memories, twisted and fragmented, played across the glass. 1,000 variations of moments I thought I'd lived, all warped by something far darker. A birthday party where the candles melted into waxy fingers. A classroom where the teacher's face blurred into an inhuman mask. A family dinner where everyone's mouths moved, but no words came out. I tried to let go, to fling the shard away, but it was stuck to my hand, its edges digging into my palm. The images sped up, blending together in a torrent of color and sound, until they were no longer memories, but something other. Faces I didn't recognize screamed at me, and places I'd never been crumbled to ash. My reflection in the shard stared back at me, its eyes wide with terror, before it twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. A voice pierced the silence, sharp and cold. "Do you see it now?" I whipped around, but there was nothing. The voice came again, closer this time, as though it was whispering directly into my mind. "This is who you are. This is what you've always been." The darkness began to shift, coalescing into shapes that moved around me like shadows given life. Their forms were indistinct, humanoid but wrong, as though they'd been assembled from spare parts by someone who'd never seen a human before. They circled me, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes glowing faintly like embers. One of them stepped closer, its head tilting to one side as though studying me. It raised a hand and pointed to the shard, still glued to my palm. "It's not just a mirror," the voice said. "It's a door." The figure lunged, and I stumbled backward, clutching the shard like a weapon. It didn't attack, though. Instead, it stopped inches from me, its face inches from mine, and stared. Its eyes weren't glowing embers anymore. They were my eyes, my face. Aniol, ein leave. My fear reflected back at me in perfect, horrifying clarity. I felt something shift behind me, and turned to see the void was no longer empty. A door stood in the distance, its surface pulsating as though it were alive. Emmanuel. The closer I looked, the more I saw that it wasn't a door at all. It was flesh, skin, sinew, and bone stitched together into a grotesque parody of an entrance. "You opened it," the voice said. The shadows around me began to move, their forms stretching and distorting as they turned toward the door. They didn't walk, they flowed like a river of darkness, surging toward the grotesque portal. I tried to back away, but the shard in my hand burned, its heat searing through my skin. "You can't stop this," the voice continued. "You've already chosen." The figures reached the door and began clawing at it, their hands sinking into the flesh and tearing it open. The sound was unbearable, wet, ripping, and guttural. The air filled with the stench of rot and decay. As the door split apart, revealing what lay beyond, it wasn't another world. It wasn't anything. It was nothing. A void, so complete and absolute that it defied comprehension. The shadows poured into it, their forms dissolving as they were consumed, and I felt the pull. The same gravity that had dragged me here, stronger now, impossible to resist. The shard in my hand began to vibrate, its surface cracking. Light seeped from the fractures, not bright but cold, a light that didn't illuminate so much as erase. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the pull of the void. "This is where it ends," the voice said. "This is where you end." I fell to my knees, the shard slipping from my hand and shattering on the ground. The pieces scattered, each one catching the light of the void, reflecting fragments of my face, my fear, my failure. The pull grew stronger, dragging me toward the door, toward the nothingness that awaited. I clawed at the ground, but there was nothing to hold on to. The flesh beneath me was slick and unyielding, and the edges of the void crept closer, devouring everything in its path. The last thing I saw was my own reflection, staring back at me from 1,000 broken shards, each one whispering the same word: why? The night started like any other, but it didn't take long before the ordinary turned into something far more sinister. I was on my way back home from a late shift at the diner, the quiet roads barely lit by the flickering streetlights. The chill of the autumn air bit into my skin, and the smell of damp leaves filled the silence. The town had a stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. As I turned onto Elm Street, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the weak light. But no. The figure stood hunched over in the middle of the road, its back twisted unnaturally. Its silhouette seemed wrong, the proportions slightly off, like whoever it was didn't belong in their own skin. My car's headlights caught it briefly, and the sight made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid waking from a nightmare. I stopped the car, heart pounding against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to back up and drive away, but I couldn't. I just stared. The figure didn't move, and for a moment, I convinced myself that it wasn't real. Maybe a mannequin, someone left as a cruel joke. Then, it turned its head, slow, deliberate. Its face caught the light, and I'll never forget what I saw. Its skin was mottled and pale, like it had been stretched too thin over the bone. The eyes, or where the eyes should been, were instead hollow, dark pits. There was movement inside those pits, small, twitching filaments, like worms writhing in soil. Its mouth opened slightly, and though no sound came out, I could swear I felt something, an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, like a hum just below the range of hearing. A sudden noise startled me, a thud against the back of my car. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat, the rear window fogged with something damp and streaky. My body acted before my brain could process it. I hit the gas pedal hard, swerving around the figure in the road. My car fish-tailed briefly before catching traction, but the image of that thing didn't leave my mind. Even as I sped away, I didn't stop until I was parked outside my house, hands trembling against the wheel. My street was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually felt safe, but now only amplified my unease. I bolted to the door, fumbling with the keys like a bad cliché in a horror movie. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a baseball bat from the closet. The house felt different, like it wasn't entirely mine anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows seemed alive, charged with an unseen presence. I double-checked the windows and turned off all the lights. My phone was on the counter, but I couldn't bring myself to call anyone. What would I even say? Hours passed, though I couldn't tell how many. The world outside my window stayed unnervingly still. And then I heard it, the faintest scratching, like nails on glass. It came from the living room. My breath caught, and I froze, gripping the bat tighter. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I forced myself to move, inching toward the living room. I knew if you'd wish to I could if I scribed died there. The darkness felt oppressive, pressing against my skin like a suffocating weight. I reached the corner and peeked in. Nothing. Oh, the rumors. The pee. Just the window, its curtains drawn. The scratching stopped, but I knew better than to assume it was over. The air felt electric, heavy with a tension I couldn't name. Slowly, I approached the window, bat raised. I reached out with trembling fingers, pulling back the curtain in one swift motion. Nothing, just my reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at my paranoia, and then my reflection blinked. I stumbled back, dropping the bat with a loud clatter. The image in the window twisted, its features warping as though the glass were water. The hollow-eyed figure stared back at me, its lips curling into a grotesque imitation of a smile. My knees gave out, and I fell to the floor, the air knocked out of my lungs. It wasn't just in the window anymore. Any view. It was everywhere. The shadows in the room shifted, contorting into unnatural shapes. The walls seemed to breathe, the sound of their movement like wet, tearing fabric. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was silent again. My body shook uncontrollably, but the figure was gone. The house felt empty, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of emptiness that made you feel like something was still watching, waiting. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to think, but deep down, I knew one thing for sure. That wasn't the last time I'd see it. Whatever it was, it wasn't finished with me yet, and somehow I had the sinking feeling it never would be. The next day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't concentrate on anything beyond the lingering terror that wrapped itself around my thoughts like a constricting vine. My hands shook every time I reached for a plate or poured coffee. And my co-workers asked if I was okay. I lied, saying I didn't sleep well. Truthfully, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel rested again. By the time my shift ended, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in deep orange and red hues. The sight, once comforting, now felt ominous, as if the darkness creeping across the horizon was a warning. I took the long way home, unable to bear the thought of driving past Elm Street again. My car radio was off. Silence felt safer. Every shadow cast by the trees lining the road seemed to shift, moving just out of my line of sight. When I reached my house, the sense of wrongness was immediate. It wasn't something I could explain. The air felt heavier, the stillness too pronounced. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately flipping the light switch. The bulb flickered once before staying steady. The house looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked every room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. The windows were locked, the doors secure. And yet, the sensation of being watched persisted, an itch at the back of my neck that no amount of logic could scratch away. I sat on the couch, gripping the remote like a lifeline. I turned the TV on for background noise, hoping the voices of late-night hosts and their laughing audiences would drown out the silence. It didn't work. The sound felt hollow, detached, like it was coming from somewhere far away. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, expecting something to emerge from the darkness. A noise upstairs shattered my fragile composure. In a single, deliberate creak, like a footstep on old wood, my heart leapt into my throat, and my grip on the remote tightened until my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The creaking came again, this time closer. I forced myself to stand. The bat from the previous night still leaning against the wall by the staircase. My palms were slick with sweat as I picked it up, holding it like a shield. Step by step, I ascended, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The hallway stretched before me, dark and uninviting. I moved toward the source of the sound. The door to my bedroom slightly ajar. The sliver of light spilling through revealed nothing, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I nudged the door open with the bat. Every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. The room was empty. My bed was unmade, the blinds half drawn. Everything looked as I'd left it, but the feeling of wrongness was stronger here. Yes, I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every surface. Then I saw it, a mark on the wall near the window. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. 4 thin, parallel lines, like claw marks, etched into the plaster. My breath hitched, and I took a step back. The marks weren't deep, but they radiated an unsettling energy, as if touching them would burn. I reached for my phone, intending to take a picture, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The battery had been full when I left work. A sound behind me made me whirl around. The bat raised. The closet door, which had been closed moments ago, was now ajar. My chest tightened as I stared at the dark gap between the door and the frame, half expecting something to leap out. Slowly, I approached, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I reached out with the bat, nudging the door open. It swung silently, revealing only clothes hanging neatly inside. But at the bottom, something caught my eye. A small object nestled among my shoes. I crouched down, hesitating before picking it up. It was a photograph, the edges worn and yellowed with age. The image was of a family, parents and 2 children, standing in front of a house that wasn't mine. I flipped the photo over, and my stomach dropped. Written in shaky, childlike handwriting were the words, "They never left." A cold wind brushed past me, though the window was closed. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows on the walls deepening. I backed out of the room, clutching the bat and the photograph. My mind racing, the house felt alive, its silence now oppressive, filled with the weight of something unseen. Back downstairs, I grabbed my keys and ran for the door. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out. As I yanked the door open, I froze. Standing on the porch was the figure from the night before, its hollow eyes staring straight at me. My scream caught in my throat as it tilted its head, that awful wrong smile spreading across its face. And then it stepped inside. The moment it stepped inside, the air grew heavy, oppressive, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My grip tightened on the bat, though I knew deep down it wouldn't be enough. The figure towered over me, its presence more suffocating than its height. It didn't lunge, didn't move quickly, just stared, its head tilting in slow, deliberate movements. That awful smile widened, impossibly large, its corners stretching far beyond the bounds of anything human. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The shadows in the room seemed to reach toward the figure, wrapping around it, merging with it, as though it were the source of the darkness itself. My back hit the wall, and I pressed myself against it, trying to sink into the plaster, as if it could swallow me and take me somewhere safe. "Get out!" I finally shouted, my voice cracking, a poor attempt at authority that sounded more like a plea. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, those hollow eyes boring into me. The smile twitched, and its head tilted the other way, as if amused by my desperation. The bat in my hand felt like a twig, useless and laughable. My breathing quickened, my chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The room around me seemed to pulse, the shadows growing darker with each beat of my panicked heart. And then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk so much as glide, a sudden and unnatural shift that brought it inches from my face in the blink of an eye. I swung the bat instinctively, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. A cold, biting wind followed the motion, cutting through me like shards of ice. My arm fell limp at my side, the bat slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes filling my vision, swallowing everything else. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. It didn't speak, but the silence carried weight, pressing down on me like 1,000 voices, screaming all at once. The shadows around me writhed, twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend, forms that seemed alive but not of this world. A single word echoed in my mind, not spoken, but planted there, like a seed burrowing deep into my thoughts. Stay. The word reverberated through my skull, drowning out everything else. My hands flew to my ears, trying to block out the sound that wasn't really a sound at all. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, the photograph crumpling beneath me. The faces of the family stared up at me, frozen in time, their smiles now looking warped, almost sinister. The figure straightened, the smile fading from its face, replaced by something even more chilling, a blank, emotionless void. It raised one long, shadowy arm, pointing past me, toward the window. My head turned involuntarily, following its gesture, and I saw what it wanted me to see. Outside, the street was empty, the world eerily still. But in the distance, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, there were shapes, figures like the one in my house, standing motionless in the dark. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, locked onto me. They didn't move, didn't advance, but their presence was a promise, a threat that made my stomach churn. The figure in my house stepped back, merging with the shadows until it was nothing more than a whisper of darkness in the corner of my vision. The room grew unbearably cold, frost creeping across the windows and the edges of the floor. I wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the figure was gone. The oppressive weight lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. My body shook uncontrollably, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no logic to it, no explanation that fit within the bounds of reality. I grabbed the photograph, now crumpled and damp from the frost that had seeped into the room. The words on the back burned into my mind. They never left. My hands trembled as I tucked it into my pocket, not daring to leave it behind. I knew I couldn't stay here. The house wasn't safe. No place was safe anymore. I grabbed my keys and stumbled to the door, the bat forgotten on the floor. As I stepped outside, the cold air bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill I felt inside. The figures in the distance hadn't moved, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I got into my car, fumbling with the ignition as my hands shook uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The figures faded into the distance, but their presence lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. The once, I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. But as I drove, the road stretched endlessly before me, the streetlights flickering ominously. No matter how far I went, the shadows seemed to follow, creeping closer with every mile. And deep down, I knew I couldn't outrun them. Envy, surely, I couldn't outrun them. As I drove through the suffocating darkness, the road seemed to unravel endlessly in front of me, twisting into an infinite void. The headlights of my car pierced the night, but their reach felt feeble, as if the shadows were absorbing the light itself. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned pale. A weak attempt to anchor myself to reality. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional thud of gravel beneath the tires. My breaths came shallow and rapid, fogging up the windshield in uneven bursts. Every fiber of my being screamed that I was being followed, yet the rearview mirror offered no proof, just an abyss of darkness stretching back forever. Then, just as I thought the monotony might lull me into a false sense of safety, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, loud and abrasive, making me jump in my seat. My hand darted toward the dial to turn it off, but before I could, a voice emerged from the chaos, distorted and low, like it was being transmitted from the depths of the earth. "You can't run." The words slammed into me, reverberating in my chest like a physical blow. My hand froze midair, and my heart pounded so violently I thought it might tear through my ribs. I swerved slightly, the tires skidding for a moment before regaining traction. The voice didn't repeat itself, but the static lingered, hissing like a living thing. I turned the radio off, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But the silence that followed was more oppressive. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, their gaze almost tangible. Almost tangible. Swallowing hard, I forced my eyes back on the road, but the unease gnawed at the edges of my sanity. A flash of movement caught my eye, a fleeting blur darting across the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, the car lurching forward as the tires squealed in protest. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to see through the windshield, my eyes darting across the shadows. Nothing. There was nothing there, just the empty road and the oppressive blackness beyond. But I knew what I'd seen, even if it defied logic. It had been there, a figure, impossibly fast, its outline wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. My breathing hitched as I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. The headlights flickered, dimming momentarily, before returning to full brightness. The road ahead looked the same, but my instincts screamed otherwise. It felt like the darkness was closing in, suffocating me, swallowing the light inch by inch. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. The car surged forward, the engine roaring louder than before, as if straining against an invisible force. My gaze flicked between the road and the rearview mirror. Every shadow now, a potential threat. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, far in the distance but unmistakable, a cluster of faint glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. They weren't headlights. No, they were too organic, too alive. They hovered at irregular heights, moving in unnatural patterns, as if whatever they belonged to didn't obey the laws of anatomy. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. As panic set in, I floored the gas pedal, the car jerking forward with a burst of speed. The glowing eyes grew smaller, fading into the distance, but the sense of being hunted didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger, like a predator savoring the chase. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging, and I began to feel trapped, as if I was driving through some looping nightmare. The trees on either side blurred into an indistinguishable wall of darkness, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands. Time lost meaning, the minutes bleeding into hours, or maybe it was only seconds. I couldn't tell anymore. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and the engine let out a guttural sound, sputtering as if it were being choked. My heart sank. The car slowed, despite my desperate attempts to keep it moving, the accelerator becoming unresponsive under my foot. A sickening dread coiled in my chest as the car came to a shuddering halt, the engine cutting out with a final defeated groan. I sat there in the stillness, my breathing ragged and uneven. The glowing eyes were gone, but I knew they were still out there, lurking just beyond the veil of shadows. The silence pressed down on me like a physical weight, the kind that made your ears ring and your thoughts spiral. I reached for my phone, but my fingers stopped just short of the screen. It was useless out here. No signal, no help, just me, the darkness, and whatever was hunting me. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, but every option led back to the same conclusion. There was no way out. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down my spine. It came from the forest, echoing between the trees, growing louder and more distinct. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the door handle, my instincts screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The growl turned into a series of clicks, rhythmic and deliberate, like the ticking of a predator's claws against stone. My eyes darted to the tree line, searching for movement, but the shadows remained impenetrable. And then it stepped into the light, a creature that defied description, its form a grotesque amalgamation of nightmares. Its eyes glowed with the same faint, otherworldly light I'd seen in the distance, and its body shifted unnaturally, like it was struggling to maintain its shape. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The creature moved closer, its movements fluid and deliberate, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I was paralyzed, frozen in the face of something I couldn't comprehend. It stopped, just short of me, its breath hot and fetid as it exhaled in slow, deliberate puffs. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the world around us, falling into a deafening silence. And then, without warning, it lunged. As I stared into the suffocating darkness, time seemed to collapse into itself. Envelop, gundiers, echotiers. The creature's lunge replayed in my mind like a broken record. A single frame stretched into eternity, but somehow I wasn't torn apart. I wasn't consumed. Instead, I found myself sitting on the cold ground, my breath visible in frantic puffs of air, with nothing but the suffocating silence surrounding me. My mind screamed at me to make sense of what had happened, but no logics seemed to apply. The headlights of my abandoned car flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the uneven terrain. I wasn't sure if the tremors in the ground were real, or if they came from the unrelenting quake in my legs. My hands instinctively reached for the nearest object. A branch, maybe, or a rock. Anything that could serve as some pathetic form of defense. Some pathetic form of defense. Then I felt it. A vibration. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the ground, but from within me, as though the creature had left an imprint beneath my skin. My chest tightened, and panic surged through me as I clawed at my shirt, desperate to find the source. There was nothing visible, no wounds, no marks. But the sensation grew stronger with each passing second. The oppressive silence broke with a low hum, not from outside, but deep within my ears. It rose, resonating like a tuning fork struck by an unseen force. My vision blurred, the world around me warping like heat waves, distorting the horizon. The hum transformed into whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping, blending, forming an incomprehensible cacophony. I staggered to my feet, clutching my temples as the whispers grew louder. They weren't random. They were words, fragments of sentences, half-formed ideas, clawing at the edges of my understanding. I couldn't make out specifics, but one thing was clear. They were not my thoughts. The forest seemed alive now, its once static shadows writhing like serpents. Shapes emerged in the periphery of my vision, but every time I turned to look, they vanished. It wasn't just one creature anymore. I was surrounded. The air grew heavier, thick with an unseen presence pressing against my skin, my lungs, my very soul. And then I saw it again. The creature. Or was it a different one? It stood just beyond the reach of the headlights, its form obscured by the interplay of shadow and faint light. Its eyes still glowed, but there was something new in them. Curiosity, maybe, or calculation. It tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of human behavior, and took a step closer. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey the primal instinct to run. My mind raced, grasping at any thread of logic. But there was no logic here. This was something beyond understanding, beyond reason. The creature extended one of its limbs, a gnarled and elongated appendage that shimmered faintly, as though it were partially translucent. It didn't attack. Instead, it pointed. No, beckoned. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized it wasn't trying to harm me. It wanted me to follow. The whispers in my head shifted, growing more coherent. They weren't words anymore, but emotions. Fear, sorrow, longing. They weren't mine, but they were inside me, weaving through my consciousness like threads in a tapestry. Against all better judgment, I took a step forward. As I moved closer to the creature, the world around me seemed to unravel. The trees bent at impossible angles, their branches forming grotesque arches that framed the path ahead. The ground beneath me felt less like solid earth and more like a pulsing, breathing entity. The creature led me deeper into the forest, its movements deliberate but not threatening. I don't know how long I followed it. Minutes, hours, days? Time had lost all meaning. Eudla, Daines, Hildedani had lost all meaning. The whispers became a chorus, their tone shifting from fear to something darker, more insistent. I felt as though I were being pulled apart, my thoughts unraveling into a chaotic mess of sensations and memories that didn't belong to me. And then we arrived. The clearing was impossibly vast, its boundaries shrouded in mist that seemed to glow faintly, pulsating with a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. At the center stood a structure, ancient and otherworldly, its architecture defying all logic. It was both massive and intangible, its edges blurring as if it existed in multiple dimensions at once. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on me. The whispers in my head surged, their intensity overwhelming, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my skull as if I could physically contain the chaos. The ground beneath me vibrated, and the mist parted, revealing more creatures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their forms varied but unified by the same glowing eyes and otherworldly presence. They didn't move toward me. They simply watched, their collective gaze heavy with expectation. The structure at the center of the clearing pulsed, a deep, resonant hum that echoed in my bones. It was calling me, drawing me toward it with an irresistible force. I stumbled forward, each step feeling like I was wading through thick, invisible currents. The whispers became deafening, their incoherent chorus drowning out every thought, every doubt. I reached the base of the structure, its surface cold and smooth, despite its shifting appearance. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, everything changed. The world exploded into light and sound. kaleidoscope of sensations that defied comprehension. I was no longer in the forest, no longer bound by the constraints of my body. I was everywhere and nowhere, a fragment of consciousness, adrift in a sea of alien memories. And then I understood. The creatures weren't hunting me. Nah, they were inviting me. The moment I realized the creatures weren't hunting me, but inviting me, everything shifted. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my trembling hands stayed on the pulsating surface of the structure. It wasn't cold or smooth anymore. It felt alive, almost organic, as though it recognized my presence. A flood of sensations, fear, awe, and something dangerously close to reverence, washed over me. This was no ordinary encounter. I wasn't the victim of some random nightmare. I was part of something deliberate, something vast and ancient. The structure hummed beneath my fingertips, its rhythm syncing with the rapid pounding of my heart. I wanted to pull away, to sever the connection, but my body refused to listen. I could feel it, a current of energy coursing through me, as if I had been plugged into an unfathomable power source. My vision blurred again, and the forest dissolved into a swirling void of light and shadow. Colors I couldn't name twisted and writhed like living things, their presence both beautiful and terrifying. Then, without warning, I was no longer standing in the clearing. I was somewhere else entirely. The air here was heavy, suffused with an oppressive stillness that made every breath feel like an act of defiance. The sky, if you could call it that, was an endless expanse of churning gray clouds, shot through with veins of glowing crimson light. The ground beneath my feet was black, cracked, and smoking, as though scorched by some ancient fire. There were no trees, no landmarks, nothing to ground me in any recognizable reality. And yet, I wasn't alone. They stood all around me, their glowing eyes like beacons in the dark. These creatures were different from the ones I had seen before. The Vestad stood harder, larger, more imposing, their forms shifting constantly, as if they couldn't decide what shape to take. They didn't move closer, didn't attack. They simply watched, their collective gaze a crushing weight on my mind. The whispers were back, louder than ever. Came delay. This time, though, they weren't fragmented or chaotic. They were unified. A single voice, speaking in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me. Enla, Agata, Etos, Miwiwajut, Dekliwa. You are the bridge, the voice said, its tone resonating in my chest like a struck bell. You are the key. I staggered backward, my knees buckling under the weight of those words. English, go on, they'll do. Time to the wait. The whispers continued, pouring into me like a flood, overwhelming every thought, every instinct. Images flashed before my eyes, scenes of destruction, of worlds crumbling into ash, of faces contorted in fear and despair. And at the center of it all was the structure, its pulsating glow like a heartbeat in the void. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was raw, my chest burning as though the air itself was toxic. The creatures stepped closer now, their movements synchronized, deliberate. One of them extended a clawed hand toward me, its touch cold and electric as it pressed against my chest. And even as it pressed against my chest, I felt a jolt, as though lightning had struck me. And then everything went still. In that moment, I understood. The structure wasn't just a gateway. It was a tether, a link between worlds. And I was the missing piece, the conduit through which its power could flow. The creatures weren't here to destroy me. They were here to prepare me. My mind rebelled against the knowledge, but it was too late. The connection had been made, the bond sealed. I could feel it now, a vast network of energy stretching out into infinity, each thread leading to a different place, a different reality. And at the center of it all was me. Yet the center of it all was me. I was no longer just a person. I was something more, something less, a vessel, a tool, a bridge. The ground beneath me began to crack and shift, the glowing veins of light spreading outward in a web of pulsating energy. The creatures stepped back, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that burned. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. The whispers reached a crescendo, their voice now a deafening roar. You are the key. You are the beginning. You are the end. And then, with a sound like the tearing of fabric, the ground gave way, and I fell. The fall was endless, and yet it felt like no time passed at all. My senses flickered between numbness and overload, colors I couldn't name, sounds that weren't sounds at all, but vibrations that twisted my thoughts into knots. My body wasn't falling. It was unraveling, like a thread pulled loose from a tightly woven fabric. And then, with a bone-jarring thud, I was whole again. I hit the ground hard, the impact rattling every bone in my body. The air was thick and stifling, carrying an acrid metallic tang that made my throat burn. I tried to sit up, my limbs trembling from the strain, but the weight of everything, of where I was, of what I was, kept me pinned to the ground. The landscape was a nightmare. Blackened earth stretched out in every direction, jagged spires rising like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. The sky above churned with dark, roiling clouds, streaked with veins of molten red light that pulsed in time with the beating of my heart. Or was it the structure's heart? The boundary between myself and it had blurred to the point of dissolution. The creatures were there too, their glowing eyes cutting through the gloom like searchlights. They surrounded me in a wide circle, their forms shifting and flickering, always on the edge of becoming something else. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. I could feel their presence pressing down on me, a suffocating weight that left no room for doubt. "It is time," the voice said. It wasn't the whispers anymore. It was a singular, commanding presence, speaking directly into the core of my being. I pushed myself up onto my knees, my hands sinking into the scorched ground. The soil was hot, almost molten, and yet it didn't burn me. It welcomed me, as if I belonged here, as if I had always belonged here. The realization made me shudder, but there was no escaping it now. The connection had been forged, the path set. The structure loomed before me, larger than I had ever seen it, its pulsating glow casting long, flickering shadows across the barren landscape. It was alive in a way that defied comprehension, its surface rippling like water, its glow shifting through colors that made my head ache to look at. I stood, my legs weak but steady enough to carry me forward. The creatures didn't move to stop me. They parted as I approached, their forms bowing slightly, as if in deference. It wasn't respect they were showing. It was acknowledgement. I was no longer just a human stumbling blindly into their world. I was part of it now, a piece of the puzzle finally slotted into place. The structure's surface rippled as I reached it, a low hum emanating from deep within. I placed my hand against it, and the glow intensified, enveloping me in its light. The pain was immediate and all-consuming, a searing heat that tore through me like a wildfire. I screamed, the sound ripped from my throat by forces beyond my control. And yet, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. This was what I was meant to do. The light spread, pouring out from the structure, and into the ground, into the sky, into me. I felt myself dissolve again, my body and mind unraveling into threads of energy that wove themselves into the fabric of the structure. I was everywhere and nowhere, my thoughts scattered across an infinite expanse of time and space. I saw worlds collapsing into ash, their skies darkened by storms that raged endlessly. I saw cities consumed by fire, their streets choked with the cries of the dying. I saw the structure in every one of them, its presence immutable, eternal, and at the center of it all, I saw myself. I was the structure. I was the bridge. I was the key. The creatures began to chant, their voices, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every fiber of my being. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. This was the end. This was the beginning. The light grew brighter, the hum louder, until it was all there was. I was no longer a person. I was a conduit, a vessel through which the energy of the structure flowed. The pain was gone now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was what I was made for. This was why I existed. And then, with a final blinding flash of light, everything went silent.